Welcome to the Triage Method podcast. Special edition, kind of, not really. It's episode 100, so I guess that's a milestone. And to celebrate that, me and Paddy are together this week, so that should be good for two reasons. One, you get to see us both together, get to see our chemistry and all that sort of stuff. But also, that means there shouldn't be any audio glitches or anything like that this week.
Unless this just fucks up when it's saving or something.
But other than that, all should be pretty clear. So, as always, before we do get going, note that if you've come to this podcast to list or to get the knowledge on how to set up a fat loss diet and all that sort of stuff, you could also opt for our coaching service. We do currently have coaching spaces available. So if you're thinking like, right, this information's cool, but I want to get right on the path, specifically want guidance, let's get going, the coaching is an option for you, so you could work with.
And that's both in terms of the one-to-one coaching and the group coaching. Both of those, you're going to get guidance with your nutrition. And you are pretty much full. Like, you probably could accept one or two clients if they were like, look, I've got injuries or something, or they're a population that you were like, I really want to work with that person. Or they were like, look, I need to work with Gary, you know. I have like 5 spaces left. Lee has a good few spaces left because he only just started, and we want to fill him up soon enough. So if you are interested, I would definitely suggest getting in touch sooner rather than later, because so many people get in touch with me. They're like, oh, I'm thinking of starting in like 2 weeks, and like I can't keep track of all these people that are like, you know, 2 weeks maybe. So I'm not going to remember to remind you. So get in touch when you're ready. I suppose that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
But yeah, all of those, you will get dietary recommendations from us. With all of those, we'll help you with your diet, help you set it up if fat loss is the goal. And again, the reason we're doing this episode now is because, first of all, we want to have these all in a kind of coherent structure like we did with the training ones, even though obviously, you know, this is a podcast, you're not going to get every single nuance. That is what the site is for. That is for us to be like, did I say that the best way possible? What about this little small, almost insignificant thing? Let me just add it in here. So the podcast obviously is basically two lads having a chat about health, fitness, diet, nutrition, lifestyle, all of that stuff. The actual articles on the site, that's a little bit more of a deep dive, you know. And we are really trying to produce quite a lot of articles these days. Well, at least I am. Gary, I think he's done 1 this year, but anyway, that's irrelevant. So there is lots of information on site if you are looking to dig in a little bit deeper, because again, like the stuff that's said on the podcast, it's not as full of nuance, it's not contextualized as much, so you know, you don't get the full picture, you know. So I definitely would look at the articles that we have on site. And again, if you are a beginner to this, we do have the beginner's ebook, which kind of simplifies all the stuff that we're going to talk about, right? So again, if you're interested, there is coaching available and you will get dietary advice with that. However, again, summer is coming up. I know that, you know, a couple of thousand people listen to this podcast and they're looking to set up their nutrition. They're looking to, you know, perhaps lose some fat, and coming up to summer, you know, you want to look fucking jacked, shredded, tight, lean, whatever the buzzword is, you want to look that when you're on the beach, right? So again, we're roughly, whatever it is, 12-ish weeks away from June. So that's a good time period to start looking to, you know, lose some body fat if that is your goal, coming into, you know, a holiday or something in June, July, August, that kind of time frame. We have 12 weeks until summer, right? So, fat loss. I don't want to effectively just recap everything we did in the last episode. So, if you haven't already, definitely go back and listen to the last episode, because that talks you through how to start thinking about setting up your diet overall, right? Talks you through calories, talks you through some of the considerations with that, talks you through protein, fats, carbs, and fiber, right? And they're the main things that we need to be concerned about, right? However, once we start shifting gears, and that just kind of gave us a maintenance, a framework to start thinking about our diet. And again, like with all this stuff, you don't actually need to track calories. You just need to know where they are. You don't need to track every single minutia. You just need to be aware of where they are currently, and then you can start manipulating, tweaking things from there, right? So just keep that in mind. Even though we're going to give like specific numbers and stuff like that, you could use a different dieting style, different dieting method to achieve the same outcome. And again, we go into this on site. in all the tiered system that we have, you know. So you could be tier 1 and just use habit-based change. You could be tier 2 and use more portion control stuff, or you could be tier 3, which is more like calories, macro tracking, right? And we're going to discuss a lot of stuff from the perspective of tier 3, because that then informs the practices you would have in tier 2 or even tier 1. You know, you'd be using that to move towards that, even though, as we've said before, we kind of think most people should end up in tier 2. Like tier 3 is not the most advanced tier that you must be at. It's like, this is a means to an end, a means to better understanding of nutrition and all that kind of stuff overall, right? But most people can get the results that they want from tier 2, and also most people find it's easier to sustain and maintain using tier 2 stuff, you know. So they all have their place, different times of your life. You're going to use different stuff. But today's focus, today's podcast, is on fat loss specifically. So you now understand from the last episode how to roughly start thinking about your diet, setting it up, what you should be thinking about, calories, macros, the whole shebang, right? So you're starting to go, okay, I think I can get a hold of this. I can get a grasp of what I need to do, right? And maybe you do use a kind of maintenance figure for 2 weeks to a month, you know, and you're like, all right, I've gotten better at tracking, because that's the first thing. We need to have good adherence, and it's going to be harder to be adherent if you are making the diet harder by, you know, being in a calorie deficit. You're already hungry and stuff, so it's going to be harder to actually adhere. So you probably want to start off dieting phases with some sort of phase where you are focusing on just nailing your adherence down, actually nailing getting control of your diet, full stop. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are in a diet, not in a calorie deficit. You want to have control over that. But I'm going to presume, again, you've listened to the last episode, you've done that, right? So you've done some time at maintenance. You have a rough understanding, you know, maybe not be perfect, it's not very precise, it's not perfectly accurate, but you have a rough understanding of what calorie level you need to either maintain your weight, gain your weight, lose weight. You have an idea of where your activity level is at and your calorie level is at in terms of, you know, how many calories you take in, right? So you have some understanding. That's the fundamental thing that we need to have, right? So Gary, someone comes to you, one of your clients, we get a new sign up. They're like, Gary, I want to work with you, and I need to get absolutely jacked, absolutely shredded for summer. You know, I know roughly where my calories are at. You know, they're at, we'll say 2,500, right? And they're saying, yeah, it roughly maintains my weight. Where do we start with this person in terms of designing their plan of action with the diet? You know, obviously the training stuff we've discussed before, and again, there are considerations when you're dieting. Maybe you don't have as much energy available, so maybe your volume recommendations, you probably go on the lower end of things. But we're not actually going to touch on that too much today. We're just looking at it from the dieting perspective, the actual nutrition perspective. So again, they want to get jacked, Gary. Do we just drop calories to 1,200 and up cardio, tell them to go for 20k steps every day? Like what's the process?
Yeah, so like anytime that I have someone kind of signing up with this goal, the first thing I want to be clear on is that, right, they get exactly why we would make the decisions in the first place. Because, you know, some people sign up, and if they're more on the beginner end of the spectrum, you know, saying things like a calorie deficit or explaining that we need to reduce calories or whatever, that mightn't actually make sense to someone. So if you're listening to this podcast and maybe you didn't listen to the last episode or whatever, the first principle that we're trying to achieve with any fat loss diet is that we're trying to reduce calorie intake, assuming energy expenditures keeping the same. Basically, we're trying to get into a deficit of calories where we are burning more calories or more energy than we are taking in. So one of the main ways that we can get there is by reducing calorie intake in the diet. So that's the first thing I want to make clear.
And why would we want to do that? Now, obviously, fat loss is the goal, but what's that going to do in the body? Like, if I go into this magical calorie deficit, like, where am I getting this energy? Like, why does that matter?
Yeah, so like that is actually a good question, because I remember like my sister asking me a question about that before, being like, but like, how do you just lose fat, you know? And like the thing that's worth knowing is that you, like, all of the fat that you have in your body is energy. It's potential energy that's there that you can actually use. So that's important to realize, because sometimes people think, oh, but if I eat too little, like, that's a really bad thing. I won't have, you know, any energy available. Whereas most of us have plenty of fat available, you know, on our frames that we can use, that we can break down, that we can oxidize for energy to fuel all of our basic bodily processes. So whether it be your brain, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, all the things that you need to be able to stay alive and function well each day. Basically, they decide to take up fuel from your fat instead. Well, most organs anyway. So you can take up the fuel from your fat, and as we do that, that obviously then leads to a reduction in overall body fat, because what you've done is you've created a deficit of energy. So you're saying to your body, right, I'm not actually going to take in enough to give you everything that you need. So then your body's response is to say, all right, I have to get it from somewhere, and it gets it from your fat stores. It can come from other stores as well, such as, muscle glycogen stores, liver glycogen stores, a little bit of kidney glycogen, so there's other stores available, and in some cases you can get it from amino acids as well. So, they are available.
Which is generally what you don't want. And again, this is when we're looking at it, that's something that we're trying to minimize as well. Because like anyone can lose weight. I could just put you on 1,000 calorie diet, right? Literally, whatever your maintenance is, doesn't matter. I'm just going to put you on 1,000, and you're going to lose weight, right? Because you're just not eating enough, so you are burning more. Now, there are some potential adaptations that would occur. However, you get to a stage where you are in such a deficit of energy that you start burning through muscle potentially, especially if you're not giving the body a reason to keep that muscle. Like, you're not engaging in resistance training, for example. So that is something that you want to be aware of, that your protein, the protein stores that you have in your body, which is your muscles effectively, they can be used as energy. And that's what people mean when they're saying like, oh, I'm going to go catabolic. If you ever hear that term, thrown around by the bodybuilding community, like losing fat is inherently catabolic. Yeah. You are catabolic. Or what they really mean is, I'm going to be so catabolic, or I'm going to have shifted this catabolism towards like burning through my protein stores, i.e. burning through my muscle stores, which is obviously not what you want if you want your physique to look a certain way, which most people do. They don't want to just be a smaller version of themselves right now. They're unhappy with their shape or whatever. They don't want to just be the same shape, the same look, but just a little bit smaller. At least the majority of people don't want that. So that is something that you should really understand. And like, if you are a coach and you are kind of looking into this a little bit deeper, like you can get into like the biochemical pathways. You can go through like beta oxidation. You can actually look into it and go, okay, so like, how are we say we're burning through this fat? Like, what does that actually mean? And you can then look at like, all the whole ATP stuff and how that, energy is liberated. And then you can also get into it and be like, okay, so the way we actually, like, what happens to that fat when you burn it, like, you can actually then figure out, you're like, okay, well, this effectively, you breathe it out, you sweat it out, that CO2 and that kind of stuff, that's where it goes, right? So you're actually like breathing this fat loss, but ultimately you don't really need to know all that stuff if you are just looking to lose some fat. Yeah, it's a cool little tidbit of information. Yeah, understanding, like I'm a biochemist, I could say, oh yeah, understanding all these biochemical pathways, everyone needs to know it, but like it's simply not the case. And again, even if you are a coach, it's not necessary that you do know all those things, but it is necessary that you understand that it is fundamentally a calorie deficit that gets us to this position where energy stores are being burned through,
Yeah, because like, even though some of that stuff can be like quite deep and, as you said, like unnecessary in a practical level, I think knowing that, that you're actually creating a deficit, so there's just this deficit, this void that needs to be filled up with some other energy stores, I think that's quite useful, because it actually explains a lot of the other things that you go on to talk about, because if you know that your body can use amino acids or glucose or fat for fuel, then that actually explains a lot of the dietary decisions, because as you alluded to, when we're trying to lose body fat, it is about also trying to maximize the anabolic signals within that context through both diet and nutrition, and to some extent lifestyle as well. So to get to the point, I like my clients to be aware of that stuff, because I think if someone knows exactly why they're doing what they're doing, it tends to lead to better adherence, and it tends to build self-efficacy as well, because they're in a position where they're like, you know what, I actually know what I'm doing, I know why I'm doing it, and that's ultimately what leads to longer term change, is them being actually in control of that situation. So that's the first thing. Explain to the person, right, this is what we need to do. We need to find a way that we can reduce your calorie intake or increase your energy expenditure to try and put you into some sort of calorie deficit. First step for me most of the time with most of the people that sign up is to try to make a dietary change, as opposed to just trying to get someone to exercise more. Because the way I look at that is, dietary changes do not involve any extra time in your schedule. So, it is literally a case of just eating less. Whereas with more and more
Which
exercise.
may actually even give you more time.
Yeah, exactly. You can have more free time and more spare money around the place. It's useful, you know. Whereas with exercise, it can be a case of, right, you know, if we want to equate, let's say a 300 to 500 calorie deficit per day that we would create through nutrition, if we want to do that through exercise, we're looking at like, I don't know, an hour of continuous exercise per day. You know, that's 7 extra hours a week, so that's a lot. So generally, I don't go straight for that. Generally, step one is to try and reduce calories in the diet, particularly when people are already physically active, because obviously there are benefits beyond just the actual fat loss side of things. So generally, what I would do from there is I kind of look at it in, like, for most clients, it's somewhere between a 10 and probably more so 15 and 30% calorie deficit. 30% being far more on the aggressive side of things, although not that aggressive either, and then 10% being like quite a slow, quite a conservative deficit. Generally most people would fall kind of somewhere in between, so somewhere around maybe a 20% calorie deficit.
And it should be noted as well with the degree of the deficit, like this both applies if you are advanced or a beginner. Like there's going to be more appropriate or less appropriate modalities, or rather choices within that. For example, if you have a newbie, they're literally coming to you, they're like, yeah, I've been tracking for the last 2 months, I basically just have a handle of it. They haven't really been training too long, maybe they have been training for, let's say, 2 years maybe, and they don't really have a handle on their nutrition, and maybe they have some pretty bad practices within the gym, but they've been doing something, right? Like, while they might have a lot of fat to lose, in that case, you might not start them off on a 30% deficit, even though you're like, yeah, you could probably do with being a little bit more aggressive in this fat loss. But you know, coming into that this individual hasn't been tracking that long, doesn't have this really nailed down, and a slow and steady approach is probably going to be better, especially considering they're in that kind of newbie phase with training, especially if we're trying to then maximize their training, we're cleaning up any habits. You kind of look at that and go, we might have the potential to build a little bit of muscle here, so you don't want to be too aggressive with the calorie deficit, because then you just cut off all that potential muscle growth, because you're just simply not feeding it. And also you're potentially making the diet very hard to actually sustain, and make it very hard for that individual to actually adhere to those dietary practices, you know. So I know people listen to that and go 10 to 30%. I'm like, well, obviously I want to go quicker, so let's go for that 30%. But that's not always appropriate, and while everyone always looks for the fastest route, that's generally not the best route. Like the best route is you don't even feel like you're dieting, and all of a sudden you get results in whatever 12, 16 weeks, you know, and you didn't even feel restricted. You know, that's the best case scenario, you know, a few maybe lifestyle interventions such as, the exercise stuff, and then also maybe the NEAT stuff, the non-exercise stuff, a little bit of that, and then a calorie deficit that isn't so aggressive that you're like very food focused and very much thinking about your food. You just have a calorie deficit that's, a very slight one that still actually produces results, because this is also the thing. A lot of people, this is more so in guys as well, where they'll effectively be like, yeah, no, I am eating a calorie deficit, and their weight just won't change. They're just their weight is simply not changing. You're not eating in a calorie deficit then, even though you want to think that, oh well, my maintenance is 5,000 and you're eating at 3,000. You're like, yeah, I'm in a 2,000 calorie deficit. Your maintenance simply wasn't 5,000. You're just lying to yourself. Or adherence is just extremely poor at that 3,000. If your weight is not moving, that you think you're tracking 3,000, and those 2 binges that you have every week now, that's actually bringing you back up to the 5,000 maintenance level that you were at. So again, just because you hear those numbers, 10 to 30% of your total calories, that doesn't mean that they're appropriate for you. Like we've already kind of bypassed this, assuming it's been done. But when I start with someone, basically the first 4 weeks is just getting a handle of calories, basically a maintenance phase. Maybe if again the person has been tracking their calories for a long time, maybe like a 5%. If I'm like, I think this is where you should be at, we're just going to just below that, just so we start getting a little bit of fat loss perhaps, But that's generally the first 4 weeks, and then you can start going a bit more aggressive. You can go, okay, let's bump this up to 10%, see where we're at with this, and then see how you can go on from there. But for most people, I just wouldn't jump into that 30%, which is quite hard, because while we're giving percentages of your calories, which is probably more accurate and applicable for people to do, what's generally recommended in the health and fitness industry is you need to be in a 300 to 500 calorie deficit, and that's definitely a good range. That's something I actually would agree with. I'd be like, yeah, that's probably a good range for most people. However, you have to then base it back on your actual calorie intake and how fast or slow you want to actually lose weight, and what is appropriate for you as an individual. Like a 500 calorie deficit, well, that's great as just saying a number, 500 calorie deficit, that's what you need to be in. Like if your maintenance calories are 1500, you're a smaller female, like a 500 you're on 1000 calories, so it's like, that's, you have to take that, but the same also holds true if you're saying like, okay, I'm a 50 kilo female trying to lose a few pounds and my maintenance calories are 1500. A 10% deficit to that is roughly 150 calories. So that means that fat loss is going to be very slow and steady, and that's going to have to be, again, this trade-off that you have, because you could go into a bigger calorie deficit, you could get faster results, but you have to realize that basically nobody feels full on like 1200 calories, and slipping up, like dietary mistakes are much easier if your calories are extremely low. Like again, like if I eat 200 extra calories and my maintenance is like 5,000, who the fuck cares? Like literally, who cares? Whereas if you eat 200 extra calories and your maintenance is 1,500, it's like, they're bulking calories now, So again, like you have to factor in where you are as an individual. And while it's all great and well to have all these sound bites and go, 10 to 30% or 300 to 500 calories, ultimately you have to bring it back to you as an individual and then figure out what is appropriate for the rate of loss that you actually want to achieve and what is actually appropriate for you to achieve. Because I know, again, everyone wants this fast, and yes, like we're going to lose a kilo per week, but that's just not appropriate for everyone, which I suppose brings us to the next point. Like, what is an appropriate rate of loss for someone if they're kind of going, look, he said 10 to 30%. Like, you're a coach, obviously, like you coach hundreds of individuals at this stage, so you have an idea of like, okay, I know exactly what to look for, what to expect, right? But if someone's going into this and they're like, I've never really done this before, like, what's appropriate for me? How fast should I be losing? How slow should I be losing? And if I am thinking of, I have a holiday in August, and you're saying perhaps like a slower approach is, more applicable to like a smaller female or a smaller male or whatever, should I start dieting now for that? Do I extend the time period? Because everyone else seems to say like 12 weeks diet, that's all you really need, Like talk me through the kind of rate of loss sort of thing.
Yeah, so generally my range is like 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week on average. And I always put in that caveat of on average, because otherwise people make premature dietary decisions just unnecessarily, and it can kind of throw you further off track. So 0.5 to 1%, but sometimes it's more appropriate to go a little bit above that, especially if you have more overall body fat. If you have more overall body fat, you can generally get away with faster rates of loss. For people who are already very, very lean, then I'd be being more conservative. I wouldn't be going for 1% body weight loss per week, because as we alluded to at the beginning of the podcast, the lower body fat you have, the more likely you are to dig into other sources of energy, such as amino acids, which can come from your beloved muscle, and that's obviously not what you want if you're just trying to lose body fat, especially if the goal is to improve your body composition. But even also from a health perspective, you don't want to get rid of your muscle mass. So yeah, that 0.5 to 1% body weight range would generally be what I'd be aiming for. So if someone's, let's say, 80 kilos, that's somewhere between 400 and 800 grams per week. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it really does start to accumulate. And generally what I would do personally is, if I was like doing a longer dieting phase over let's say 12 to 16 weeks, then I might start off a little bit more aggressive. So I might, first few weeks, maybe 1.5% even of my body weight, because obviously I'd be at a higher body fat percentage at that time. Let's say first 2 weeks or so. then maybe down to that 1% range. And then as I start to get that bit leaner, hunger becomes more of a problem, energy levels are more difficult to deal with in terms of keeping training going, keeping college going, whatever. Then I might go more towards that 0.5% range. So I think that's important to be aware of, is that you can play around with these things, and like 1% isn't necessarily better than 0.5%, and vice versa, because it just depends on where you actually are in that fat loss process. Because where you start in terms of your diet is very different to where you actually finish up. And unless you've actually had a successful diet over a long period of time, I don't think you can actually appreciate what that feels like, because you see it so much with I think bodybuilders in particular, because obviously they're the extreme example. They finish their, let's say, gaining phase, and they're like, I'm so sick of eating, I can't wait to diet, I'm looking forward to being hungry. Then you speak to them 12 weeks later and they're like, oh my god, hate my life, can't wait to be bulking, I'm so hungry, I have no energy, I'm drained, I have no libido, I can barely get to sleep, all these sorts of things. And obviously you should hopefully have dietary practices and lifestyle practices to try and minimize those effects. But at a certain point, especially if you're competing in bodybuilding or physique sports, so it's to some degree unavoidable. So I think it's worth understanding that, because obviously that's not necessarily applicable for the vast majority of people listening to this podcast, but it is going to apply to some degree. You will feel a little bit different at the end of your diet, and you may not still be gunning for that 1 to 1.5% body weight loss per week, because you're more likely to be digging into lower energy availability status, and you're probably going to feel more of those dietary side effects starting to accumulate at that point. So that would be generally what I would be aiming for. But just to get back to the average point, the reason that's so important as well is because, as I said, it can lead you to make ineffective decisions. And the reason for that is because if you, let's say, have a 1% loss 1 week, and that's your target, and then the next week you lose just 0.5, 0.6%, then you might say to yourself, okay, I'm not at enough of a deficit, I need to make the deficit bigger. It could just be that your food content was a little bit different, so you different food content in the gut, different levels of water retention secondary to stress or secondary to sleep deprivation or something along those lines. More training stress again can increase water retention or lead to fluctuations in body weight, and those different variables can lead to fluctuations up and down from day to day and even from week to week. So the reason that is so key to understand is because if you're just comparing week to week, you're making decisions on a small time scale. If you give yourself, let's say, month to month, and you review every 4 weeks or so, then you have a far better idea of what's going on, because then you can say, okay, on average I lost 1% per week across the last 4 weeks, but some weeks were just 0.6%, some weeks were 1.4%, but you're still averaging out where you want to be. So I would generally look over that longer time scale, and even more important in females, because when you have menstrual cycle variations, and again, like some women, they don't see that variation throughout their cycle, it's not as significant, but some women have massive fluctuations, especially around the time of their period. So if you take that into account with females, definitely easier to make better decisions, because you could have week 1, oh yeah, I didn't lose any weight this week or whatever, I just kind of stayed the same. Week 2, oh my god, there's a little bit of an increase. Week 3, down again. Week 4, up again. Whatever pattern it happens to be for a given individual, if you look at it across the 4 weeks, you're going to have far more useful information that can inform your decisions going into subsequent 4-week blocks, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, and I think for women as well, it is very important, because they do generally tend to follow that kind of sine wave, that kind of like up 1 week, down the next, up 1 week, down the next. And again, it might trend ever so slightly down in the direction that we want, but on any given day it could be fucking massively up, or it could be massively below that trend line. So it is very important for women to be aware that your cycle does play into this, even if it's not necessarily like it's inhibiting fat loss or anything like that, but there is an interaction with there is an interaction with fat loss capacity. Probably not something that I would dig into too deeply or pay too much attention to, but the more important thing is that water retention and water balance overall, that does play into this whole equation. So you need to be aware of that your weight is going to fluctuate, and there's nothing you can do about that, as long as you're a regularly cycling female. And again, whatever that means for you, I don't know, that could be 60-day cycles for you as an individual. And you'll probably notice some trend with that. The more you do this, the more you keep yourself aware of this whole thing. Anyway, back to the last point. So you're saying we're probably in the range of trying to lose at a 0.5 to 1% body weight per week, right? And this allows us to nicely transition, and you touched on it just there a second ago, but this allows us to nicely transition into the next point, and then the next point after that. So the next thing is, right, so say I start the deficit, and we'll just say it's at a 250 calorie deficit, right? That's where we're starting at. We're at a 250 calorie deficit, and then I've been losing 1% per week. You know, actually, we'll say 500. 500 is probably be easier, right? So we're at a 500 calorie deficit, and I've been losing at 1% per week. Been doing that for 6, 7, 8 weeks. It's been going good. Yeah, I've been looking at the averages. They're going good, right? But it started this slow, right? So now I'm losing that for the next 4 weeks. I'm losing that, 0.75% per week. You know, and then the next few weeks it's 0.5, 0.25. So first of all, we need to explain that, and then second of all, we need to understand when to make dietary changes. You know, because first of all, people just jump the gun, like you were saying earlier on. They just jump the gun. They're like, "Oh fuck, today's up. Let's change calories. Something's wrong," right? But then also people do the opposite, and they're like, "Oh, well, I set my calories. I'm in a calorie deficit, because I started this diet at 3,000 was my maintenance, so I'm eating 2,500. I'm in a deficit, and they assume that deficit is going to extend or sustain them all the way through until they're absolutely shredded, So we have both dichotomies: people who never really change their calories, even though they probably should, and then we also have the people who change their calories effectively on a whim, and it can be hard to understand this if you don't understand the why weight loss is slowing, like what's going into that, and then that'll inform how you actually start looking at, okay, this is when I need to change calories, right? And then we'll kind of round out this discussion. There's a few other things that we just want to touch on in terms of cardio. That's one, because that plays into our calories, and then maybe touch on some of the macronutrient stuff as well. But I think this is something that if you understand this next bit, effectively like why your calorie level changes, then you actually understand the vast majority of weight loss,
Yeah.
So take it away.
Yeah, so I think like first things first is like the absolute simplest thing you could take on board here, and that is that like losing body fat, you are a smaller person at the end of it. As a result, you're going to be burning less energy, and that's really important to take away, because I think it's often just a totally forgotten variable. Like people get real caught up in discussions of metabolic adaptation and all that sort of stuff, and that's interesting, of course, and we'll be discussing it, but you also have to just think that, I am a smaller individual. Like if you had those first 6 weeks, let's say, of great success with your diet, let's say you're an 80 kilo individual, you lost 1% body weight per week before you started to slow down a little bit, you've lost 5 kilos of body weight at that time point. And let's say we just assume that you happen to be burning 30 calories per kilogram of your body weight, and that's kind of your average range, then like that's 30 kilos or 30 calories, 5 kilos, 150 calories less that you're going to be burning per day. So that's 150 calories gone away from that deficit before you take into account anything else. So if you were saying it was just 150 calories and your deficit was previously 150, then your rate of loss would be expected to be dropping, with all of your other variables ignored, it would be expected to drop by a third already, So if you were,
and this is actually just really like simple to understand.
Pure simple, yeah.
Like really simple to understand. If I get you to hold a 5 kilo dumbbell and walk around with it every single day, do all your daily tasks, it makes them harder, right? If I get you to go about your general day, hold this 5 kilo dumbbell, and you at the end of the day you're like, yeah, fuck, I burnt extra calories because I'm holding this, and then I tell you to let go of that 5 kilo dumbbell the next day you're burning less calories, even if you did the exact same stuff, because you're simply not holding that 5 kilo dumbbell. Like it's very intuitive once someone points it out, and you're like, yeah, actually carrying around extra weight, it actually burns more calories, which if you actually then think about it a little bit deeper, you would also then realize that a lot of what people say in terms of like metabolic adaptations and different things is completely ass backwards, right? Like they'll look at someone who is like morbidly obese and they'll be like, oh, like they just have a really slow metabolism, when in fact they actually have a faster metabolism, like, because that's just a collection of your metabolic processes, because this person weighs 400 pounds. So simply doing the exact same thing as you, we walk down the street, we walk for 5 minutes, that person who weighs 400 pounds has to carry around that 400 pounds, right? This is why they get out of breath so fast. This is why they find exercise difficult. This is why when you're training an obese person, if you are a trainer, like, there are certain considerations that you have to put in place that you don't necessarily have to put in place with someone who only wants to lose like 10, 15 pounds, you know? So this person that weighs 400 pounds, they are burning more calories. Their metabolism is on fucking fire because they weigh 400 pounds. They're carrying around that 400 pounds. Every single activity they do is like the most intense calorie burning session. Like, you go out and have a game of bowling, you're like, all right, I burned like 100 calories doing that. 400 pound individual goes out and has a game of bowling, they're like, yeah man, I burned fucking 3,000 calories just going back and forth. You know, they're carrying around 400 pounds all day. You know, if I strapped the backpack on and literally, you know, did the whatever equation, you weigh 200 pounds, here's 200 extra pounds to carry around, man, your calorie expenditure will be through the roof, you know? So again, when you think about it and you understand this, like, you start figuring out, you're like, okay, well actually, you know, the general thought process that people talk about, it's completely ass backwards, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, but to be fair, to play devil's advocate, like, we're talking solely there in terms of like absolute energy expenditure.
Yeah.
And you can have differences in like relative energy expenditure, because if someone is obese, like if they're morbidly obese, then the vast majority of the tissue on their body is body fat, which is less metabolically active than other tissues in the body. So if you were to look at it on like a per kilo energy expenditure basis, you'd see differences, but on an absolute level, they're burning way more energy. So when you hear people discussing things like, oh, you know, my friend, he or she eats way less than me, but they're still like really heavy, it's just because they burn less energy. Like, probably not, unless there's massive differences in your activity.
Just probably not if actual energy expenditure was, or not energy expenditure, actual activity was matched.
Yeah, if
they're
matched.
Like, if you're like, oh, I do 10,000 steps per day, he does 10,000 steps per day, like, they would burn through more calories than you, you know? So what people do is they don't match for all these other things. They're like, oh, we eat the same and we both do the same workout, but then you factor in that you actually cycle to the gym there and you have a very active job. You look at your steps per day, you're looking at that and you're like, oh, I'm on 15,000 to 20,000 per day. And you look at this other individual, you're like, they're really struggling to lose weight, and you look at their steps per day and it's 1,000 to 4,000. You know, it's like, okay, so there is actually a difference in terms of the output day to day, you know?
Yeah, and like, the reason that stuff's important to discuss is because anytime you have these conversations about energy expenditure and energy intake and everything, people try to present anomalies and say that, oh, but what about this person? And you can actually almost always explain it away. Like, there's almost always an explanation as to why someone is having body composition outcomes different to someone else. But anyway, as I was discussing, when you begin to lose body weight, that's going to account for a difference in your rate of fat loss, because you are now a lighter person. And that can be actually really, really significant in some cases, because if you look at like social media and you go onto any personal trainer's page, you'll see like transformations where people have lost 10, 20, 30 kilos. Like, that is huge. Like, if you were, let's say, 90 kilos and you dieted down to 60 kilos, you've lost a third of your body weight. Like, that's going to make a massive difference to your level of maintenance, to your level of calories required to maintain your body weight. So if you started at that position where your maintenance was 3,000, and let's say it scaled perfectly, and now your maintenance is now 2,000, like, that's a big difference there. But again, it's being almost solely explained away by the difference in your body weight. So I think that's important to understand, because it's definitely like the first piece of the puzzle that explains these changes in loss that people don't really account for. So if we had that example again of you know, that 80 kilo individual, their energy expenditure, or they lost 5 kilos, the energy expenditure decreased by 150 calories as a result of that. There's also additional processes that are going on there. So as we touched on in the last episode, there are other aspects of metabolic adaptation that can account for differences. So for example, someone, if they're not standardizing their non-exercise activity thermogenesis through something like tracking their steps every day, that could reduce a little bit. They might find themselves, they're at the start of the diet, they felt real active, but they're feeling a little bit more sluggish now. They're not, taking the stairs as often. They're not as excited about going for a walk at lunch or whatever it might be. So if you're not standardizing those things, that can account for another bit of a difference. So let's say that was another 100 calories of a difference from being less active across the week. So now that person's 500 calorie deficit, it's been dragged down to 250 because of the change in body weight and the change in the amount of steps that they're taking. Let's say then there's another 50 calories through other things, such as, they're a little bit colder. They're not sweating as much in bed at night. They're not as warm during the day. And they're also finding that when they're speaking to people and when they're presenting at their work meetings, they're not twitching as much. They're not, playing with their hands as much. They're not tapping their foot. They're not blinking as much. All of those things are more subconscious. So you're obviously not thinking about how often you're moving and twitching and everything when you're when you're in your seat. Oh yeah, I do it on purpose, especially on the podcast. Those are the things that you have less control over, which is why we're such fans of tracking steps, because it is something that has a subconscious element, you could say, but it absolutely is under your control, and that you can.
Yeah, it's kind of proxy. Like, it's not a great measure.
Yeah.
But if we keep control of that, we have some sort of proxy for where our activity is at, and it's much easier to track that than track like twitches per day.
Yeah, like what are you gonna do?
But yeah, I think that hopefully makes people aware of that. Like obviously the deficit you set at the start.
Yeah, it's a moving target.
It's always going to be moving, So the more you are aware of the actual like calories in, calories out equation, what goes into that, the what metabolism actually means. Like the more you're aware of all that stuff, the more you know, the better you can actually understand why things are changing, right? But ultimately, if you are just an average normal person, you're like, I just want to lose a bit of weight, you don't have to really dive deep into this stuff. You just have to know that this is going to be a moving target, and that when you progress, you are probably going to have to change that target so that you can continue progressing at the rate you want to progress, right? And what I mean by that is you might start your calorie deficit. You might, again, 3,000 calories, that's your maintenance that you've found. You go, I want to be a little bit more aggressive with this. I'm going to do 500 calorie deficit, right? And again, that works for 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever. And it's been slowing, but it's been still working, right? And then it gets to a stage where it's like, okay, well, the rate of loss, it's not quite what I want. I want to keep moving a little bit faster towards my goal. I only have another... You're going away in August, we'll say, right? You only have another 8 weeks until your holiday, and you're like, all right, I just want to lose this last little bit. I don't like this little bit, this roll here at the end of my abs. I want to get rid of that, right? So you estimate, you're like, I have about 2, 3, maybe 4 kilos left to lose, right? So again, you need to go back up, and you need to be like, right, I need to get back to that 1% rate of loss, right? So how do we change our calories? Like even if you're not that exact situation, like how do we know when to change your calories, and what does that look like in terms of the actual calorie change? Do we just drop it another 500? Is that how we do it? Like we're just always dropping by 500 or 30% or whatever way you started it? Like how do we actually go about this? What's the crack?
Yeah, so for me it would depend on like what the difference in the initial rate and the current rate that you've seen. So for example, if we keep nice clean numbers, you were losing a kilo per week. That was it. Boom. That's what you were doing. You were losing a kilo per week. You had reduced your calories by 500 calories, and it was all simple, all dandy, all going smooth. But then eventually it nudged its way down, and you've been kind of consistently losing half a kilo per week now. Like that's where you're at now. You thought you were still in the 500 calorie deficit. Then if you look at that difference, so you know that you've had a difference in your rate of 50%, you initially reduced by 500 calories, you've had a loss in body weight, you've been feeling some of the differences we described, then what I would be looking at there is not saying, all right, let's take another 500. I'd be saying, all right, what do I need to do to account for the adaptations that have taken place? So for using those simple numbers, you could reduce calories by another 250, and that would put you somewhere in the ballpark of being in that initial 500 calorie deficit that you actually started in. So the difference now is that you're still in a 500 calorie deficit, but you're eating less overall absolute calories. So your energy intake is lower, but your relative energy intake is maintained. So you've still got that 500 calorie deficit. So that is what I would be looking to do. If it was the case that your energy or your change of body weight had come to an absolute halt. Like you weren't losing anything.
Which would be rare. Like,
Yeah,
you know, like you have to keep going even though, you know, you started off in a 500 calorie deficit. You have to keep going and keep going.
Yeah.
And effectively, you've stayed on that calorie level so long that this is now your new maintenance.
Yeah.
You know, which is rare. Like that was the other extreme that I was saying, where people, they're like, oh, I'm in a deficit. I'm in a deficit. And they're not. They've just been in that deficit for so long that this is their new maintenance.
Yeah.
You know, which is rare.
Yeah, it is rare. And like the only time you'd see something like that pop up would be like if someone, like, one, like you said, they kind of just thought that maintenance was a fixed thing and they just stayed there hoping that it was going to work, and now they're doubting the kind of calories in, calories out thing. Or they just initially started at a 100 calorie deficit, which got accounted for pretty soon because obviously you catch up with that. Or potentially what may have happened was that they actually just changed their activity levels totally. They weren't accounting for NEAT or anything, and now they're way more sedentary, or they moved jobs or something along those lines. So some things can account for that, but generally what I'd be looking for is to try and account for the difference between the initial starting rate of loss, the current rate of loss, and then make up for it with calories like that. So if you had initially dropped by 500, you now estimate it's around a 250 deficit, you take away another 250 calories. And generally when you're starting to make those adjustments, at the beginning it can be a very simple process because, you know, you've got enough calories available where, you know, you can still eat mostly your normal diet, and, you know, macronutrients are fairly evenly distributed and it's all fine. And at this point, questions always come up about, right, where am I getting these calories from? Like, what am I actually going to drop out of my diet? And generally, like, we would advise keeping protein constant, or in some cases increasing it as the diet pushes on, but we're rarely ever like going to reduce protein as a means of getting rid of calories, like, because as we alluded to, that's one of the anabolic stimuli that's going to ensure we're keeping around our muscle mass, but it's also going to be helpful in terms of managing hunger, managing appetite.
And worst case scenario, it just contributes to, you know, gluconeogenesis. It just contributes to having a bit more carbohydrates in the system, you know, and like that's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is it preserves all your muscle mass, if not increases your muscle mass.
There you go.
You know?
Yeah, so protein, like, I'm not taking away someone's protein to try and reduce calories.
And again, if you go back to the last episode, we're saying roughly what was like 2 to 3 grams.
Yeah.
You know, again, like we were saying, like we generally set people at 2.2 to 2.5, somewhere in that range. If I knew someone was like dieting, I'd kind of go, okay, your weight is probably going to change, so this is kind of a little bit hard to fully estimate. You know, if you started off your 100 kilos, you go 2.2, oh, that's 220 grams of protein, and then you end the diet at 60 kilos. Like, you're probably going to over consume protein if you had just left it even at the 2.2.
Yeah.
You know, so you could adjust it over time, and it probably would be a more accurate thing to do to use lean body mass as your marker for that. But that's also very, very hard to do. Like, where is your lean body mass? Like, what does that actually? Like, how do you measure that? You know, so I always just set like 2.2 to 2.5. Again, if I'm in a dieting phase, I might start them off at 2.5 and then we'll assess over time. But I could see a case where you might reduce protein if they have lost a significant amount of weight, and you're kind of like, okay, well, like we started at 2.5, we're now actually at 3 grams per kg, you know, and purely by virtue of you have lost a lot of weight and the protein target stayed the same, you know, and I could see an argument for reducing that there. However, we have to factor in, like you said, the hunger, the satiety aspects, where like protein is quite satiating, so it keeps you feeling fuller for longer. So we do want to keep that in the diet. We do want to keep that at our meals, so that, you know, hunger isn't something that's decreasing our adherence to the actual diet, to the actual calories we want to hit.
Yeah, and to be honest, like if we were in those situations where they had a lot of body fat at the start of the diet, I would just be going at the lower end of our protein kind of range anyway, because I'd be saying, right, we don't have to calculate it based on lean mass, but this person doesn't need loads of extra protein just to serve fat mass, you know, so you can go with on the lower end of the range in those cases. And then, as you said, as the person begins to lose weight and they get to the lower end, it might match up with a slightly higher relative per kilo of body weight target anyway, so you're kind of covering all your bases with that taken into account. And then, like, when it comes to carbohydrates and fats, like, I think we've said it many times in the podcast, but generally, like, what I would start with, especially if someone was at the higher end of our fat recommendations. So we said in the last podcast, somewhere between 0.6 and 1 gram per kilo for overall fat intake is generally where we're going to recommend most of the time. If someone was already at that 1 gram or more, then I'm definitely going to be taking away fat to try and get the deficit moving. But it's not always a case of just picking one either, because like if you're trying to create a 500 calorie deficit and the person was only on 60 grams of fat, like how are you going to create a 500 calorie deficit? You know, you're just going to take away all their fat. Like that's clearly not practical. So there is a combination aspect there. So but if someone was at like 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day and they're eating 150 grams of fat, yeah, boom, cut off 50 grams of fat. Like you don't need all that anyway, so you can take it away. But the lower the absolute fat intake someone has, the less scope there is to actually continue reducing that. Not just because we're thinking about, you know, the need for fat soluble vitamin absorption or supportive hormones or whatever, but rather just because it's kind of harsh to tell someone just to eat 10 to 20 grams of fat per day, because it's just not practical to eat most of the foods that you would actually enjoy. And that includes even just trying to eat porridge or bread or foods that you would think have very little fat anyway. So yeah, generally I would kind of be thinking I'll try and take as much fat away to the point where it's practical. So when someone gets to the point where they're like, oh Gary, I'm really struggling, I'm very limited in my food choices now because fat is a little bit low, and they're getting towards that 0.6 gram per kilo recommendation that we have as the bottom end, then I'm starting to think, okay, yeah, let's actually take away some carbs as well. Boom, let's take away some carbs. But I think what a lot of people do is they initially just think, oh yeah, diet time, cut carbs, boom. But we're generally not going to do that, because that's what's going to serve your actual activity and your actual training and potentially the adaptations to that training. So
yeah, like ideally we're trying to keep carbs as high as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah, like I mean, if you're sedentary, like you're not training, like definitely not as important, not something you need to worry about as much. And I'd honestly just be thinking about whatever diet allows you to maintain
calories.
Your satiety, hit the calories, and that's pretty much it. But if you're training, like you want to keep carbohydrates as high as possible, you've already got an energy deficit, so you want to make sure that you actually have the preferred substrate available to fuel your activities. So keeping carbs as high as possible, taking away from fat, but noting that you are going to have to take away from carbohydrates at some point, especially as you begin to get kind of deeper into the diet. So they'd be, I think, what I would typically be opting for.
I 100% agree, and I think that gives people a good understanding of like adjusting the diet over time, both from the calorie perspective, you know, like we were touching on, like they have all these metabolic adaptations, just, you know, they maybe move around a little bit less, and obviously their body weight is a little bit less. They're kind of the two big ones, you know. So if you aren't standardizing NEAT, we should just say it again, you should. And the way we use it is that proxy measure of steps. Again, it's just a proxy measure. It's not perfect, but gets the job done, gives us something to work with. And then you need to, again, adjust your intake based on your trend over time, so you can stay at the rate that you want to stay at, you know. And again, that could mean that you need to adjust your diet once over a 20-week period, you know, maybe after 12 weeks or something. Or it could mean that because you chose a smaller deficit, you need to adjust a little bit more often, like every 4 weeks or something, you know. But again, ideally we want to stay at a range that keeps us moving in the right direction at a rate that is appropriate for what we actually want to achieve, you know. Like again, if you have 20 kilos to lose, you know, that's a potentially year to 2 year event, you know, depending on the individual, if you've never dieted properly before and whatever, you know. So like don't just think in terms of a 12-week diet and that kind of stuff, you know. Like this could be a multi-month, multi-year thing, right? And in one of the other podcasts we're going to do, maybe in 2 time, we're going to do like transitioning to like a maintenance phase, both from the perspective of at the end of a diet, because that's often just forgotten. Like people are just like, I don't know what to do at the end of the diet. Like they effectively run the deficit until it becomes maintenance. That's what most people, you know, end up doing, or think that that's what they have to do, you know. But we can talk about like transitioning to an actual maintenance phase at the end of a diet, and then at the end of like a gaining phase as well, because they're two distinct things, but they have a lot of like commonalities to them, you know. But I think from that episode, I think that covers everything that we need to cover, apart from the cardio stuff, right, which we'll touch on now in a second. But I do want to also just touch on the fact that if you are in a deficit of calories, like you want to think of it, calories are energy, right? They're a proxy for energy technically, because ATP is the body's energy. That's what you actually want to talk about, but it just becomes completely impractical to talk about it like that. So calories are a good proxy for energy, you know. But if you have less calories in your body, that means that your recovery, your ability to recover from training, from even just your NEAT, your steps, your all that kind of stuff, they all potentially go down. You know, you've less recovery capacity because you simply don't have the fuel for it. Not just to actually do the event. You might have enough fuel to do the event. You might have enough fuel to get through that 2-hour workout. But you don't have enough fuel to actually recover from it. You know, and that's not just from a protein perspective, which most people kind of just automatically, they understand that they're like, protein builds muscle. So they're like, yeah, but I'm getting enough protein. But that's not the full story, because you still need calories. This is still an energy intensive process. Like muscle building is an energy intensive process, and this is why it's less likely that you're going to build muscle while you are in a calorie deficit. Now, it's not impossible, not at all, you know, but it is less likely because you simply aren't paying the workers to build muscle. So, you know, if you're not paying them, they're like, well, yeah, you can put all the building blocks here. You have enough amino acids. That's, yeah, we could do this. You're giving the signal. You're going, yeah, do the job. You're doing your resistance training, but you're not paying them. So they're like, look, if I have some time when I feel like it, I might do that, you know? So that is something that you want to keep in mind, because again, this is another thing that you see a lot of people will not change their calories because they're like, yeah, I'm recomping, bro. You know, I'm building muscle and I'm losing fat at the same time, which is just so rare. However, because so many people use like anabolic steroids, which effectively that's one of the effects that you could just use them for. You could eat the exact same amount of calories as you've been maintaining your body weight on and just use anabolic steroids, and all of a sudden you would build more muscle and potentially lose more fat then just from changing the hormonal environment, you know. And that can kind of, you know, fuck people up in terms of their ideas of what's possible with the diet, you know. And that's just a bit of an aside, you know. So just realize that if your calories are reduced, you are in a deficit, that your recovery is lower, and potentially that means that your training has to change, which is actually another factor which we didn't touch on when we're talking about, you know, why does, you know, weight loss slow effectively. Like, it could be by virtue of the fact that you used to be able to do 5 sets for each exercise, and now because your recovery is less, you've had to drop that down to 4 sets, you know, which, while it's not a huge contribution, you know, I don't think you should be thinking of workouts in terms of burning calories, except for the cardio we're going to discuss in a second. Like it is still a contribution. So if you were able to do 8 sets per workout and that was your recovery capacity, and now you're like, all right, it's actually gone down to 6 sets per workout, per muscle group, you know, and that's obviously a little bit less calories burned in that workout, you know. So that is something that plays into it overall, you know. And again, you might also notice that your strength goes down as well, which means that, like, you know, you're actually doing less work. So again, potentially calories are, you know, calorie expenditure is a little bit reduced, but these are all like minuscule things that just play into it, right? But just realize that, just keep that in mind when you are looking at your training program. Again, like even like we said earlier on, the experience at the start of a diet versus the experience at the end of a diet, they're not necessarily the same thing. And again, that's the same with the training program. The training program at the start of the diet is not necessarily the same training program at the end of a diet, right? Now, cardio, we have to touch on this. I actually don't think there's a huge discussion on this because we've talked about cardio before, but in this context, we're talking about cardio from the perspective of weight loss or fat loss, and this is something that people use. Now, people think there's some inherent property to cardio that burns through body fat, you know, and that's not necessarily the case. Like, yes, you could say that lower intensity cardio is, you know, it uses fat as its primary fuel, you know, whereas the higher intensity stuff that uses carbohydrates as fuel, you can make that argument, and then you could say, you know, obviously if you're going to liberate these fatty acids, you're going to use them for fuel, it's going to burn more fat, you know. And again, it's a good thought process. At the end of the day, it's irrelevant unless calories are controlled for, you know. But either way, it's still a valid thought process. But I think people get so they think that cardio has some inherent fat burning capacity beyond just the fact that it uses, if you do lower intensity, it uses fatty acids as fuel. And they think that they must do cardio, which is just not the case. You could do a complete fat loss diet, get absolutely shredded out of your mind, and never even do an iota of cardiovascular work, right? Not necessarily what we would recommend generally. We recommend cardio, a mix between, you know, higher intensities and lower intensities, again, appropriate for your goals, who you are. We've talked about cardio before. But talk us through that. So if cardio doesn't have this inherent fat burning effect, is it just calories then?
Like, it sort of is. Like, it sort of is just a case of, like, if someone is doing more cardio with the intent of losing body fat, is pretty much is just increasing their overall calorie deficit through energy expenditure. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean there aren't, like, you know, second order effects there, because, like, one of the things that does change in someone who is, let's say, like, a 500 calorie deficit is not a 500 calorie deficit. What I mean by that is a 500 calorie deficit of someone when someone is very sedentary, let's say, and a 500 calorie deficit when someone is incredibly active, they're different things, because in one you've got very high levels of energy flux through the system, whereas the other person, they're not actually burning that much energy in general. And up to a certain point, like, appetite regulation tends to be a little bit better regulated when people are quite active. And one of the things that you do see in the research is that people who have those, you know, upper ends of activity, they've got better actual weight loss maintenance, so that they actually maintain their weight loss better in the presence of plenty of exercise than those who have lost a similar amount of weight without similar levels of exercise. So the outcomes do actually vary. So in general, like, I think it's a fairly sound idea to use activity to increase your energy expenditure, but I'm not generally thinking of it in terms of, like, more being better, because what I want to do with anyone that's trying to lose body fat, or anyone that signs up in general, is find an approach that they're likely to maintain for the long run. And one of the problems you can get into when you actually start to use cardio purely as a fat loss tool is that you're not actually viewing it as a long-term thing. So it can actually make your long-term weight loss outcomes worse as opposed to better. Because what do people do then? They finish their fat loss diet, they've been doing 4 to 6 days of 30 to 60 minutes of cardio, and then suddenly they're like, oh, I'm done, I'm lean, and they stop doing the cardio. And now suddenly their energy expenditures dropped, their appetite's already through the roof, and they totally overcompensate, and suddenly their presumed 500 calorie surplus as they go back into their gaining phase is actually more like a 800 to 1,000 calorie surplus, and they've reversed out, and they've gained kilos of fat weeks later again. So
this is actually even compounded by the fact that, just like we discussed earlier on, like, you lose weight through a diet. So the length of time that it takes you to burn 500 calories at the start of a diet is not necessarily the same length of time it takes you to burn 500 calories on a cardio machine at the end of a diet, you know? And this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't use time as a proxy for calorie burning when you're in a diet. Like, don't be like, oh, I do an hour of cardio. That's irrelevant, you know? Like, you need to standardize it to calories burned, you know? And you can do that on the machine itself if you're using a machine, or you can use like a Fitbit or watch or whatever, you know, calorie burning tracker watch. But even then, it's still just kind of a proxy. It's not 100% accurate, you know? But if you weigh less at the end of a diet, you're burning less calories doing the same time of cardio. So if you do an hour of cardio to start, like, say you burn 500 calories in that hour at the start of your diet, like, that could get down to like 250 by the end of the diet. You've lost a lot of weight, but you've also increased your efficiency of movement as you diet, because as you do that exercise for longer. You're just more efficient at it. You're better at running now, you know? So it is very hard. And again, this is why you see things happen where it's like, okay, actually, you know, I've been doing all this stuff, I've been doing everything right, and all of a sudden it stopped working. And it's like, yeah, like, the adaptations have effectively just caught up with you. Like, humans are very adaptable, and this works for us in terms of, that's why we're top of the food chain, you know, that's why there's literally fucking billions of us. But it also goes against us if you're trying to lose weight, you know, if you're trying to lose a bit of body fat. It's like, all right, well, I'm going to adapt to whatever you fucking throw at me, and I'm going to resist losing body fat, because your body doesn't want to lose body fat. It wants to keep that. It wants it. That's a just in case. That's a starvation. That's a reserve. You know, it doesn't want to be shredded, 3% body fat, glutes striated. Like no one. Like it doesn't want to be that. Your body doesn't. You may want to be that, but your body's like, nah, fam. No, thank you. You know.
Nope.
So that has to be taken into account. That again, like just like we were saying earlier on, with your body weight changing, that affects your cardio expenditure. And like you said, you know, you could be at the end of a diet, you give up your cardio, and you know, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you've actually increased calories. You have no fucking clue how many calories you were burning if you didn't standardize the calories and you were just doing like an hour or whatever. You're like, what does that actually mean? You know?
Yeah, and that's not even to say like that like the machines or anything are accurate, because like the point here is not that you're trying to be exact with how many calories you're burning. It's more so like a reliability question as opposed to a validity question. So it's not the fact that, you know, your machine could be off by 100 calories in its estimation, but that doesn't actually matter, because all you're trying to do is try and keep it somewhat consistent. And you could do that through other proxies as well. Like sometimes, like for example, it's all right in runners or something, because like what a runner will do is they'll track maybe their heart rate, and they'll track their distance, and they'll track their RPE, and they'll track the time, and you have all these different variables, and you can kind of assume that, all right, the person's going to be burning less energy at a lower body weight, and maybe we can account for that through additional distance. But what a lot of people do is they don't account for any of that. So, you know, another example would be a cyclist, or if you're using like a stationary bike or an assault bike, you could track calories, or you could track RPM, you could track the gear, you can track the time. But what some people do is they just say, doing 30 minutes of cardio, and they hop on the treadmill at an incline, they hold on, and they just walk for 30 minutes. And, you know, at the start of the diet, they might feel, oh yeah, I have a bit more in me, I'm going to do it a bit more with a bit more energy. But then towards the end of the diet, it's just a bit more sluggish, they're holding on more. So you have to try and find some ways to actually ensure that you are actually still putting in the effort if you're doing it for the purpose of energy expenditure. So yeah, that would be that. And like tying that in with what we said about the NEAT, or just tracking your steps, like that's a better starting point from my perspective, is to try and get that habit of increasing your steps as part of your routine at a baseline, because it doesn't have the additional logistical challenges of trying to get to the gym all the time, of trying to fit more exercise in, of having to go for a shower, of preparing to get there. You know, there's more things that kind of come into planning exercise than just doing the exercise itself. And if you can just build more steps into your daily life, like one of the things I encourage my clients to do is, you know, get into the habit of, you know, listening to, if you listen to podcasts or you listen to audiobooks or whatever, like don't do it sitting on your bed, go out for a walk and do it, you know, because you're just stacking together these different habits that all impact your life positively. And that's something that tends to serve people quite well. So I would start off with that, standardize your steps, try to increase them a bit, but again, more isn't always better there. You know, don't say to yourself, right, I'm going to get 20,000 steps consistently, because that's hours of walking each day. You know, if you can get to 10,000, like that's a really nice place to be. There's nothing magic about that number, but it tends to be quite practical, and it is adding a fairly significant amount to your energy expenditure each day. And then if you want to start exercising more in terms of doing actual cardio, aerobic work, like you should be doing that for health anyway. So you don't necessarily need to view it in terms of, all right, I'm just doing this to burn more calories. You could just say, all right, I'm trying to hit my exercise guidelines. I'm going to start with getting an hour a week, and I'm going to see if I can get that much done. You could do that from the start of the diet, and you mightn't even need to do it with the view of adding more. Because what tends to happen is, if you're doing a good bit of cardio, you're active in your day-to-day life, you're also doing weight training, your energy expenditure is going to be high anyway. So it tends to be a little bit easier to lose fat in those contexts, because instead of going, let's say, from 2,000 calories down to 1,500, and meals are more difficult to put together, etc., you've increased your energy expenditure by 750, let's say, and now you've got more scope for different foods, and it's not as stressful, and dieting's a little bit easier. And that's generally what I find myself. I find it much easier to maintain lower body weights when I am far more active, and that does make more of a difference, obviously, for people. Like if you have a maintenance of 1,500 calories, it's very different to having a maintenance of 4,000 calories. And I keep coming back to that point of there being more to it than just the deficit. So if I'm really active and my maintenance is up around 4,000 calories, like I no longer need to stress about going out to eat or anything like that, because even if I'm in 1,000 calorie deficit, that's 3,000 calories. I can still go out and have a 1,500 calorie meal and have 3 more 500 calorie meals throughout the day, and it's just not even a stressor. So dieting becomes easier in those contexts. So there's definitely bonuses to more activity, but don't view it as a more is better tool, and that would be my main message as it relates to cardio.
Fucking dead right. It does also impact on recovery potentially more than steps, you know, which again, like
100%.
recovery might be an issue that we need to address as the diet fatigue effectively, you know, starts to kick in. But anyway, I think that should hopefully give people a good idea of a few launching points to think about their kind of fat loss diet. As I said, there's articles on site that kind of walk you through this a little bit more coherently, and these are just kind of launching points to kind of get you thinking a little bit more about the whole process itself, you know. But as we always say, like there is a free Facebook group that people can get into and ask questions, and like we literally reply to people's questions and give them the answers that they need. So if you're like, I didn't quite understand how to set up my calories from the last episode, or I didn't quite understand X, Y, and Z that you said on the podcast, just ask in the group and we will respond, and we will either link you to the articles that we have written on site about it, or again we'll just talk you through the specifics of your situation right there and then. And as we said at the very start, if you are looking to, you know, actually really dial this stuff in, get yourself into group coaching or get yourself into one-to-one coaching, and we can really start dialing this in for you as an individual, you know. Because fat loss, it doesn't need to be hard. You can make it hard if you want, you know. You can make it less sustainable if you want, but if you do it right, if you set things up correctly, like it can be a very easy process, you know, which that kind of triggers people sometimes when you say that, because most people's experience of dieting is the process is hard, but a lot of people, because they don't understand the intricacies, they make it harder than it needs to be, you know. And that's why we put out so much free information, because like I don't want people failing. Like failure is part of the process. You're going to have to fail every so often, but that's part of the learning process. I don't want you to ultimately fail and then never actually get results because you just didn't know what to do. Like as we said before, like our goal is kind of democratize this health and fitness stuff, and the only way we can do that is to give a lot of free information, so that the information isn't, you know, behind a paywall or something, and that's what's preventing you from getting results. It's like, no, you literally, the information is right there free for you. You know, we can talk you through it in the free group, you know. If you want to be more precise with it, like, yes, get into one of the paid coaching services that will actually, you know, really dial it in for you, you know. They're right there, you know. One of them is literally €35 a month, you know, like that's literally just over €1 per day, you know. And the one-to-one coaching is a bit more expensive, but again, that might be something that you invest in for, you know, 3 months, you know, 12 weeks, really get everything nailed down, and then, you know, go out on your own, because that's what we generally do with people as well. Like, we'll nail everything down, we'll give them a process going forward and be like, this is what we should do going forward, even if we're not working together, you know. But yeah, I have nothing else to add to that, because again, people should just join a free Facebook group, engage in the community, and if they are interested, we have services available that can help them get their diet on track, get their fat loss going, get them results, you know. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, 100%. Just to reinforce your point, like personally, I find fat loss pretty easy, but the point there is that I didn't before. And like, you know, years ago when I was first kind of embarking on the process of dieting and trying to track calories and all this sort of stuff, it was confusing. You know, I struggle with the process. You know, you lose a bit of weight and then you're like, oh, you go off track and you don't know what to change and blah blah blah. And I used to struggle with it. And the point there being that, you know, a lot of people just turn around to that and they adopt these kind of anti-diet mindsets, because they're like, dieting doesn't work. But like, it's a process. It's something.
But that's provably false.
Yeah, well, absolutely false. Yeah,
it's false. Like provably false, because like I've seen people like that, and then all of a sudden they actually embark on a successful diet, and it's like, are you just going to ignore the fact that you were wrong previously because now you've actually embarked on a successful diet? It's like, you just said that dieting doesn't work, but you've just shown that it does. Let's address this.
Yeah, and for me, it's very disempowering for people, because like, you're kind of setting up this expectation that like, right, if dieting doesn't work for you and your first time you try it, it's just not for you. That's not a thing. You know, you just back off. Just don't do it. Just accept your body. That's it. You know, and I don't think that's in any way empowering. Like,
but I've never been good at something the first time I tried it.
It's literally not how life works. Like, sorry. So, I mean, if you're after attempting a couple of diets and you're like, oh no, I can't do it anymore, it's not for me. Like, it does get better. It is a process. It's something that you build skills at, you get better at, you improve your knowledge, and like it ultimately allows you to make better decisions, make more effective decisions, and make better progress over time. So that's just what I would like to get out there, because I think it's very easy to just turn around and say, dieting didn't work for me. I'm done with that. But I think there is always, or for a lot of people anyway, there is still that residual desire that like, oh well, if I could diet effectively, yeah, that'd be great. Like, but you know, I've just kind of accepted that it's not for me, and I don't think that is empowering in any way. So yeah, I would say that don't be that person, and
Yeah,
get
anyway,
better
we're
at the
gonna wrap it
process.
up here because my father is calling me and I love him dearly. So peace
Goodbye.
out.